The election is over, but the work for the church has just begun. Now, whatever you think of politics, whatever side of the fence or the divide politically you sit on, you have to say that one of the overriding messages of this election is who people in this country trust. And ultimately, it was about a question of trust. And so we have the government that we have now because people have voted to say we trust that person more than anyone else to lead us for the next 3 years. And that's why I say the work has just begun, because the election is just the start, isn't it? And now there's 3 years of slog and work to achieve and deliver results in our country. But over or underwriting all of that, there is something else going on, because with all politics, there's all these intrigues and conspiracies and hidden agendas and things that go on in the political arena. And we don't want to become a theorist on those things, but there is something happening in the background that's not visible to the general public. And that is that more and more we're seeing in our society, and especially in the political arena, that in all parties, Christian voices are being marginalized, pushed aside, ridiculed, and even mocked. And to have a Christian faith in politics today is an unpopular position to be in. And this is more than just a shift in the culture. This is because there is an increasing in our society of a hatred for things that are godly, which is why people are now calling things that are ungodly right or godly, and righteous when they're actually unrighteous. And so there's a hatred of things godly and a love of things that are unrighteous. We sometimes call it the tall poppy syndrome, don't we? Where if somebody rises above where everybody else is, we mow them down, so we're all the same size. And it's a little bit like that when it comes to righteousness in our country, because if somebody rises up with a godly voice or standing for righteousness in any way, immediately rising up in the general populace is a feeling of, those hypocrites, or who do you think you are, or, you're no better than anybody else, that you hide behind your Christian faith. And so there's this feeling that goes around, and it is used to marginalize and to push down the Christian voice. In the Bible, we see a story about David as a young boy, and he comes into an environment where Goliath is challenging the armies of Israel and the king of Israel and the nation of Israel, and he's challenging the God of Israel. And he is mocking, he is ridiculing day after day after day. It's relentless. And the armies of Israel are cowering to that mocking and to that marginalizing of their God and their abilities. And they're scared of Goliath and the Philistine army. And so David, as a shepherd boy, walks into that environment, and he is a guy who knows God, who worships God, who spends time with God, and he comes into an environment where his God is being mocked, and his immediate response is, this is not good. We can do something about this. Our God is greater, our God is stronger, and so he comes up with this plan to take 5 stones and a sling and to slay Goliath. He stood up against the might of Goliath, and he won a victory for his country. And in our country of New Zealand, we need people of faith to stand up for what is right against the might of political powers and forces that would conspire to marginalize the Christian voice and to mock and to ridicule. Jesus is reported as saying in John 3 and verse 19, "This is the verdict. The light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear of their deeds being exposed." And this is what we find with the tall poppy syndrome, is that people don't want to come into the light. They don't want to hear the truth. They don't want to hear what is right because it exposes their own heart and their own condition. And that is what's behind the suppression of truth in our country and the hatred of things Christian. Young Daniel in Babylon was in governmental areas of power. He was a believer in God in a position of authority and of power. And he was promoted because God gave him wisdom, exceeding everyone else in his field. And he stood up for what God said, and against all the snares of his jealous colleagues in that palace, he stood as a lone voice for truth and justice and what is right and what is godly. He was hated for it. He was conspired against because of it. But with God, he succeeded to affect a whole, not only a nation, but a whole empire, to acknowledge that Daniel's God was the true God. So I have three things that I want to encourage you today to consider doing in the area of our government here in New Zealand as we proceed forward from this election. Firstly, we need to pray for God to bring our politicians from all parties, because there are Christians in most parties in New Zealand, that we want God to bring those Christians and those politicians, even the non-Christian ones, into the light, that their deeds will be revealed to this country. You know, there's been lots of scandals, lots of revelations about people doing things in the background that have not been good. I think it's good that the revelation comes, because that it means that God is bringing things to the surface and cleaning up some of the areas of power that are controlling our country. And so we need to pray that God will continue to reveal and bring politicians into the light, that their deeds may be exposed, that hidden agendas and deceptive practices may be exposed, that liars will not prosper. In James chapter 5 and verse 16, it says, "The prayers of a righteous person are powerful and effective." And the Church of Jesus Christ, if it wants the voice of righteousness to be heard in this land, must find confidence in itself and in the prayers that it has, and confidence in the righteousness that God has brought into your life. Not saying you're perfect, but there is a righteousness inside of you that has been placed there by the Spirit of God through being born again, and we need to be seeking how to bring that righteousness of Christ up in our lives, and so that it shines, so that it can be clearly seen as distinctive in the world around about us by the people that we mix with. And not only in our own personal lives, but also we need to pray for this in our politicians and realize that our prayers are effective. But one of the reasons that every other voice is rising up against us in judgment is because we have neglected to pray, or because we have lost confidence in our ability to be effective in prayer. Church, you are effective in prayer. When you pray, it makes a difference. When you pray, it moves mountains. When you pray, it shifts things in the atmosphere over our nation. And we need to do that privately, we need to do that collectively, and we need to believe that our God can make a difference. This is spiritual warfare when we pray for righteousness in our politicians. Every time there is a corrupt official exposed, we can join in the tune that says, "Another one bites the dust." It's another one that's championing unrighteousness that bites the dust. There's another opportunity for somebody who's championing righteousness to rise up. And it happens because believers are praying. So my first point is pray for corruption and hidden agendas to be exposed. Is that a good idea? It will clean up the country. It will give us better government. Secondly, we need to pray for the Christian politicians to find their voice and their backbone. For too long, Christians in politics have been intimidated by their colleagues and been like the armies of Saul, cowering in their tents, afraid to come out because of the voice of Goliath, booming across our landscape and across the atmosphere of New Zealand. But it's time for the voice of God to boom across this nation. It's time for the voice of righteousness and truth to boom across this nation and to destroy every lie of the enemy, every hidden agenda. And so for that to happen, Christian politicians need to come out and become Davids and to stand up and get a strategy from God and believe that just a simple word, a simple thing, a simple statement can destroy the lies that are going across the landscape. When they find their voice and speak righteousness, no matter what it means to their political career, we will see change in our nation. Everyday people in life actually do this already. We're not doing something that's asking people to do something that's impossible. We're asking them to do something that ordinary people do all the time. You don't have to go too far back in history to find great examples of heroes who have stood up as individuals against political powers and authorities and systems that have been perpetrating injustice and find that they have won a victory for justice and for righteousness and truth. I'll give you an example of this. There's a lady named Katharine Bolkovac, a US police officer who in 1999 accepted a UN peacekeeping job in post-war Bosnia. She was on the International Police Task Force that was responsible for training the local police to help restore law and order to that country. But when she got there and started to do what she thought she needed to do, what she uncovered and what she found was an underground human sex trafficking industry whose patrons were from the International Task Force themselves, and that some of them had been drawn into the whole practice of covering up this ghastly, unrighteous industry. And even members of the United Nations were covering it up and complicit with it. When she realized the level of corruption and cover-up, she determined to divulge the scandal. And while she was trying to divulge that and report it to higher officials and higher and higher and higher to get this thing sorted, the UN on the ground in Bosnia worked harder and harder to keep her quiet and got her fired because she was speaking up. By 2001 and 2002, she succeeded at blowing the whistle and suing the company that had sent her there and was covering up this. And her story of courage and standing up as a one individual is illustrated in the movie The Whistleblower. So we need to pray for Christian politicians to do what this lady did, to stand up against corruption and stand up for righteousness and believe that you can make a difference even as a single individual, as a lone voice. So we need to pray for Christians to stand up. We need to pray for hidden genders to be exposed. Thirdly, we need to pray for Christians in Parliament not to yield to the temptation to become corrupt. Because it's one thing to stand for righteousness, but as soon as you make a stand for righteousness, you become a target. And the enemy tries to bring you down. And temptations come your way. And shortcuts come your way. And so, you know, just like Adam and Eve, who saw the shortcut to the knowledge of good and evil through the fruit of the tree and through the serpent, when if they just stayed in tune with God, he would have given them all the knowledge they needed. You see, politicians come under pressure because they want to get things done. They want to deliver, and they're tempted to take shortcuts. And what happens is they get dragged down into the same mess that other politicians are already in, the same unrighteousness. They get dirtied. There's something about politics that can change a person's heart if they do not keep fully engaged with the armor of God in their lives. And so we need to be praying for those that are standing up and being a voice, that they will not be tempted or yield to temptation to become corrupt. Now, this example may be a little bit controversial to some of you, but the answer is not just that we have Christian politicians. The answer is not just that we have born-again politicians. George Bush and Tony Blair, two born-again Christians, lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And another whistleblower, Katharine Gun, who was a translator of the British intelligence service, saw emails where the Americans and the British were conspiring to bug UN nations who were on the Security Council so that they could have leverage to pressure them into voting for the war and going into war. And this is why I say we need to pray for good politicians who have faith to not give in to evil practices or bad practices and become corrupted themselves. And she blew the whistle and was charged under the Official Secrets Act, and they made a movie about her called Official Secrets. See, the Bible says that righteousness exalts a nation. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or not a Christian in politics. If you stand for righteousness, it will exalt the nation. In summary this morning, we need to pray for corruption to be exposed. We need to pray for Christian politicians to find their voice and stand for righteousness. We need to pray for Christians in Parliament to not cave in to the temptation to become corrupt in any way, shape, or form. I want to finish this morning with a passage of scripture from Isaiah 58, verse 1 to 3. In Isaiah 58, verse 1 to 3, we see God talking about Israel as a nation. And he says that they were pretending to be righteous with their fasting and their holy days. But secretly, they were practicing unrighteousness. And in verse 6, God says, his kind of fast, a good fast, is not what these guys are doing, but a good fast, as far as God is concerned, is when you add to your fasting to loose the chains of injustice and to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke, to share your food with the hungry and to provide the homeless with shelter. One of the biggest issues in our society at the moment is homelessness and shelter. In verse 9 It says, then you will call and the Lord will answer, and you will cry for help and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing of finger and the malicious talk. Sometimes that sounds like Parliament, doesn't it? A lot of pointing of the finger and malicious talk. And if you spend yourself on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like noonday. Well, there's a mission for the church as well as the government. And this is what the church needs to be doing. And this is what, as Christians, we require of ourselves, that we reach out to those in need, that we are generous to the poor and the needy. And that's how our generosity, remember, righteousness is based on the word generosity. And so righteousness begins with a generous heart, with an opening of our heart to others. And so true righteousness is generous. And that's how our light shines into the darkness. Because the nature of man is to withhold and to keep to himself and store up things for himself. But the nature of God is to give and to sacrifice and to keep on giving. That's true righteousness. So that's what we want and require of ourselves, that we be generous, loving people. But then that's what we require of our church too. And that's why in 2 weeks' time, we will be remembering here the persecuted church in various countries and financially supporting Open Doors as they serve the needs of those who are being persecuted for their faith. And next month, we will be remembering the victims of human trafficking and sex trafficking through supporting Hagar Ministries, so that they can repair and restore the survivors of such corruption and mistreatment of human beings. That is why now we as a church, through our efforts over the last 5 years, are now one of the top 3 in our area who are being funded. And we have received significant funding for reaching out and for providing food and food security for the next 2 years to those who are put at financial risk because of COVID-19. We are doing the business. We are pushing in. We are providing generosity. We're providing righteousness in our community. And my goodness, if every church could do that, wouldn't our nation be transformed? Wouldn't the government breathe a sigh of relief because the church is doing the job and there's less for the government to do? And that is also what we long to see from our politicians, that they would follow the lead of Christians, that they would follow the lead of the church, and that they would develop policies to help the poor and the needy, policies that don't disadvantage them, ones that give them a hand up as well as a handout. You know, sometimes they say we want to give people a hand up, not a handout. Well, that's very nice, but actually when you're struggling to put food on the table, you need a hand up as well, a handout as well as a hand up. You need both. And politicians need to stop pushing out trite sayings that sound good to a philosophy, but actually don't deliver results on the table. Policies that tackle drugs in our community, because that's a huge generator of poverty in our country. Politicians that will work for people rather than parties or philosophies. Friends, it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, every party has its own philosophy. And I want to tell you this, that every one of those philosophies has a strength and it has a weakness. And so none of those philosophies have all the answers. And every time we get a different philosophy in power, we see the strengths and we see the weaknesses played out in our country. We need politicians who are prepared to stand up, not for a philosophy, not for a party, but for righteousness, for doing what is right to get the job done, to be prepared to say that I'm going to stand up for these things, I'm going to promote these things in my party and in our country. We need to pray and act in a way that exalts righteousness in New Zealand. And we as church in New Zealand, every church in New Zealand is called to pray this way for righteousness in our nation. The election is over, but friends, the work has just begun, not just for the politicians, but for us as people of God, that we would exalt righteousness in this nation. That is our mission. That is our call. That is what God has designed us to do, that we would be salt in this nation, that we, even though we may feel like a teenage boy with a bag full of stones, that we haven't got much to offer, that we would stand up and we'd let our voice be heard. We'd let the pressure of what we have to offer be heard so that God's will can be done in our nation. You have a voice. You have power in prayer. Our voice is to petition heaven, and we're going to do that right now. I want to ask you to stand with me right now, and we're going to pray for righteousness to be exalted in our nation.